So thanks, Joe, and thanks again to the Copenhagen Cleantech Cluster. When I was here a couple of years ago, I identified 5 key barriers to moving forward with the digital agenda in cities. The first was a lack of clarity of vision. It wasn't clear what digital could do for a city. And therefore, it was very difficult from a political perspective to create a narrative that says, this is the value proposition and this is why we should invest. So I said, we need better clarity. The second is, we were focused very much on creating business cases and not thinking about value in broader terms, not thinking about the societal value proposition, not thinking about the environmental value proposition. But as a consequence, we were only delivering those projects that had positive business cases. And therefore, we ended up with the lowest common denominator. And that's something I'm going to talk a bit more about later. The third was around a lack of business model innovation. We were trying to apply digital technologies and clean technologies within the context of existing business models. And frankly, they weren't working and they aren't working. And one of the things I was saying is we need to be way more innovative in the way that we approach the market, the way that we structure and sell these products in order to get traction in the marketplace. Selling product is not necessarily going to work. We might need to start thinking about selling outcomes. That was linked to the final 2 points, which was about governance. Standard traditional governance models, standard traditional governance, thanks Dimitri. Standard traditional governance models haven't necessarily been working. We need to explore more in public-private partnership and more in public-private innovation, but also thinking about new and innovative governance models, mutuals and cooperative structures with shared asset development. And then finally, linked to that and the business model is we needed to find new forms of financing innovation. Just the standard model of finance isn't enough in the context of a fast-growing and relatively immature industry. So linked to the innovation and business model, we needed to think about new financing models, both on an equity and a debt basis, but also in terms of things like crowdsourcing, really thinking outside the box, social finance, for example. So that's what I said 2 years ago. So what's changed? So, notwithstanding the wonderful reports you've had about 3GF this morning, it's my contention that over the last 2 years, we've actually seen multilateral sclerosis, right? Everything's grinding to a very slow halt in the public policy arena. There's a lot of money being spent on flying people around the world to go to these events. Sorry, that wasn't an intentional slur. And people make their whole industries around supporting this, but we're not actually getting much in the way of outcomes. And that's an issue. And I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that we should stop multinational negotiations and public policy development, but the balance has to be right. And I think Anders was exactly right just when he started, which was, this is about top-down and bottom-up, and the balance isn't quite right. We need to focus much more on bottom-up action and making things happen. So the second contention is that there's been a victory for realpolitik in the face of austerity. So the wonderful utopian visions of clean tech and green societies and fundamental economic change haven't happened. And the reason they haven't happened is realpolitik. I remember doing some scenario analysis for a large energy company about 6 or 7 years ago. And one of the 4 dimensions of the analysis was looking at this green future. But on the other side, the opposite of that was a much more disaggregated, competitive environment where different countries couldn't reach multilateral agreement, and everyone was out to protect their own economies. And it was a world where hydrocarbons were back on the agenda in a clean mode, but with unconventionals. And that's where we are now. So with the growth of unconventional gas and fracking, that completely changes the environment for clean tech, and it makes it much harder to function. So we're going to have to up our game to deal with realpolitik. Increased South-South capital flows are really a phenomenon of the last 3 to 4 years, but they are fundamentally changing the way that capital is flowing. So traditionally, we've thought about North-South capital flows. and south-north capital flows. But now, if you go to China and you go to Brazil, and you go to the emerging economies of Mexico, south-south capital flows are just as important, if not more important, on the radar. So I spend a lot of time in Bogota, I spend a lot of time in Mexico City and in Rio. The focus is on China. How do we attract Chinese sovereign wealth, and how do we make those investments? And I would make the contention that we should start thinking about south-north capital flows. How do we attract the big institutional investors and sovereign wealth funds in the south to invest in the innovation and design capability, the knowledge economy that is the north? So we need to think about that. Anyone who's been involved in this process of trying to get renewables and clean tech off the ground and digital products and services within cities will recognize that we are suffering of death by pilot. Everything is happening at really small scale. It's looking at functional and technical specifications, and it really isn't going to that question around business model innovation, financing model innovation, and governance. And a big shout out to the Cleantech Cluster for the most recent big data proposal that's come out. I think that is absolutely the route ahead. Yes, we need to demonstrate proof of concept from a technical perspective, but the balance should be focusing on self-sustaining business models, self-sustaining financing models, and self-sustaining governance. And putting all of those together is the right answer for the package. There is a much, much greater focus on resilience. It's only as a function of things like Hurricane Sandy, but there are a whole series of events around the world that have led cities to start thinking much more holistically around the question of resilience. And from a clean tech perspective, we absolutely need to focus on this as a core buyer value of cities. And then finally, institutional inertia and bureaucracy. As a practitioner working with cities around the world, this is my day-to-day experience. It's going into cities and trying to bring together political decision makers with the constraints of realpolitik to make big, bold investments. I remember having conversations 2 years ago with the city administration in Copenhagen about big data platforms. It's taken 2 years to go through the political negotiations to release the capital to invest 100,000 euros in 3 potential bids in order to develop a platform. Now, more power to the team in the city and in Real Dania and all the other companies that, and institutions that have made that happen, including the Cleantech Cluster, because 2 years is 2 years faster than anyone else that I've come across, because you're the first to market in approaching this. But we need to reduce that cycle time to make it effective. So what, right? So if that's what's changed, what do we need to do? And I'll try and keep this as short as possible. Yes?
1 minute.
Okay, wow, that is short. Okay, so actually it's all the better because I've got to get a flight. So the first is less emphasis on multilateral agreements, more emphasis on unilateral action. That means at the city level, we have to be activists and market makers. The city has to play a fundamental role in that. We need much more targeted and pragmatic support for entrepreneurs and SMEs in the clean tech sector. It's not good enough just to provide incubators and accelerators and capital funding. We should develop dedicated core teams in the Y Combinator style that are helping with practical knowledge and experience around financing models, governance, product design, user interface design, and business models that can help those entrepreneurs to really function. But not just that, provide access to the big multinationals, the Siemens, the Ciscos, the GEs of the world, because those are the exit strategies. So we need to think about a much more activist role. I think the cluster is doing a fantastic job in convening and providing collaboration, but we really need to be much more active in providing that support. And I think the cities hold a role in developing those innovation labs. We need supply-side support from government. Government should be the key procurement engine for sponsoring SMEs into the marketplace. They have a real powerhouse behind them in developing this procurement function. They should be the first movers. They should be the rent takers. We need to focus on resilience, environmental quality, and resource and capital efficiency. When you're selling, yes, sell the business case, but these are the value propositions that really matter. Cities care about, can we make our cities more resilient? Can we improve the quality of air and the quality of water resources in the environment? And can we deliver our resource and capital efficiency or capital more effectively? Those, if we can solve those three problems, we're looking at societal, environmental, and economic benefits. That can then release public sector funding. We need to build a way more robust political narrative around future cities. This is especially true in the digital space, but it's also true in the clean tech space. Politicians find it really hard to articulate how will this make your life better as a citizen on a daily basis. We need the use cases and the examples so that we're not asking our politicians to articulate what technologies they're using and selling the input technologies, but they're selling outcomes. They're saying, we are investing in this and it will make your life meaningfully better. The challenges are X, Y, and Z, and the outcomes are A, B, and C. So that political narrative needs to be the focus of our value propositions as clean tech entrepreneurs. And then finally, institutional reform. Our government institutions were designed in the 19th century for an industrial economy. They're very good at dealing with industrial economies. That's why we're broken up into infrastructure verticals: water, waste, energy, transport. But we don't have people who deal with digital. We don't have people that deal with clean tech. So we need to reform our institutions within government and start thinking about who do we give responsibility for developing digital services and then clean tech service delivery and environmental service delivery across the city. I will stop there, Joe. Thanks, Joe. I'll go over here. You go.
A couple of things. That was great. Local question and big question. So local question is, you talked about, you clearly know about the cluster. You talked about what it could do better. Give a bit of practical advice. If you were sort of coming in as the consultant, very, very highly paid 2,000 euros for 1 minute of advice.
Well, this is $10 advice then. No,
yeah, we'll do a collection for you at the end.
We'll crowdsource it.
What would your advice be?
So, keep doing what you're doing in relation to what you're doing with the big data tender and what you're about to do with plastics and so forth. I think, you know, for those who don't know, what the Cleantech Cluster has done is acted as a proxy on behalf of the city and a couple of other agencies to run a process of developing a new tender. And that tender is bringing the big private sector players to the table to identify how you can develop a big data platform. So an active protagonist role in this process is really important. I think the Cleantech Cluster can play the neutral facilitation role. Beyond that, I think there are two things that the cluster could do. One is that it could play a much more active market-making role in incubation and development of small, medium-sized businesses. So beyond just playing the collaboration factor, could it host a fund for investment in clean tech, but providing access to the world's best experts in their respective fields, whether that's product design, kind of regulation, whatever it happens to be, that can work directly with entrepreneurs, advise them on a daily basis in a much more, what you might call a studio-based incubation model. Is what you see in Web 2.0, some of the most progressive Web 2.0 incubators. But also be able to do that as part of a public-private innovation initiative. And I think that's definitely true in the case of the Big Data Studio. I think there's a real opportunity to create an incubation studio that can help generate a whole value chain around that. But the same is true into clean tech. So I think that's kind of one thing. I think the second thing is, you know, continue to run this global network effect. I think one of the things that attracted me most to the Cleantech Cluster was the fact that they were playing an active role in creating a network effect of other clusters around the world. Yeah. That is hugely valuable to companies like ours who have vested interests all around the world. So those would be the two main pieces.
Okay, and clearly you travel a lot?
Yes.
So I want to save you having to come back in 2 years by telling us what you're going to say in 2 years.
Well, hopefully in 2 years' time, there'll be a big data platform within the city. But not only a big data platform, there'll be platforms for plastics innovation, there'll be platforms for other factors that have been driven by the Cleantech cluster. What I would also hope is that the governance structures that emerge around how we do that will be public-private innovation initiatives, where big private sector companies are coming to the table with government and the facilitation of a neutral entity. And what I would hope is that we're really innovating around the business models where if you develop a platform for innovation, that platform is owned in trust on the behalf of the people of Copenhagen with the IP held in trust so that we can develop small, medium-sized enterprise initiatives that are building on that platform in order to deliver new services. And if you are successful in that, then we can export that platform and those small and medium-sized businesses will be able to deliver the same services through the big corporate partners, the Ciscos, the Accentures, the IBMs of the world, in the other cities that are implementing those platforms. So it's made in Copenhagen, delivered in New York, supported by small and medium-sized enterprises from Copenhagen.
Great, and just finally, on a global scale, biggest hope, biggest fear in terms of, we need to act incredibly quickly now if we're going to the challenges are racing away with us and we're as you say, incrementally hobbling along. What's your greatest hope about what will allow us to catch up and eventually overtake the problem? And what's your greatest fear about why that might not happen?
So my biggest hope is that we really embrace digital technologies to help drive the resource efficiency. I think getting more information and insight into the way that the city works as a system of systems requires data and information. A platform to interrogate that data will give us way more insight into the way that our systems interface. And the real value is at the intersection of those systems between transport and energy, between energy and housing. And really understanding the nature of the interface is critical. The biggest fear is actually not something that happens necessarily in Copenhagen, but it's happening elsewhere in Latin America, is as we see an emerging middle class in developing world cities, there's a real concern that one of the first triggers is taking car ownership. And you only have to go to Rio and Sao Paulo to identify the impact that that has. Now that's just, you can use car ownership as a proxy for resource consumption, but that growing middle class effect is going to have a massive resource consumption effect. And our systems in those emerging market cities aren't built. There's lock-in, as Dimitri said. The design of cities in Latin America didn't include metros and trains. Everything was delivered in public transport by buses. Those buses share the same roads as cars. Seoul had to deal with this in the 1970s. This is a different order problem. For me, that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity for companies in Copenhagen and in the developed world to develop products and services to export to those cities. But if I was living in Sao Paulo or Rio, that would be an impending nightmare.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.